Have you ever wondered what set Elijah apart, making him one of the most powerful prophets in history? What secret did he hold that allowed him to call down fire from heaven and perform miracles that defied the laws of nature? In today's episode, we're diving deep into the life of Elijah to uncover a truth that every believer needs to know, an insight that could transform your spiritual journey in ways you never imagined. But before we get into that, if you're passionate about deepening your understanding of faith and uncovering the hidden gems of Scripture, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Decode Vale. Our channel is all about exploring the profound mysteries of the Bible and how they apply to your life today. So, stick around, this is going to be a powerful one. Elijah's early challenges. Elijah's story begins with a call from God, one that sets him on a path few would dare to walk. The land of Israel, once flowing with milk and honey, had fallen into darkness under the rule of King Ahab. Ahab had turned away from the Lord, embracing the false god Baal. The nation, once blessed, was now mired in sin and idolatry. In the face of this wickedness, God called on Elijah to deliver a message that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Elijah's mission was clear and uncompromising. He was to declare a drought, one that would dry up the heavens and bring the land to its knees. There would be no rain, not even dew, until God gave the word. Imagine the weight of this command. Elijah, a man of deep faith, had to stand before a corrupt king and a misguided people and proclaim a judgment that would bring suffering to all. But Elijah did not waver. He obeyed without hesitation, understanding that the word of the Lord must be delivered, no matter the cost. With the drought came hardship. The earth cracked, the rivers dwindled, and the crops withered. But Elijah, in his obedience, found himself in a position where only divine intervention could sustain him. God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, provided for his prophet in ways that defied expectation. He led Elijah to a hidden creek, a small stream of water that continued to flow even as the rest of the land dried up. Here, Elijah drank, quenching his thirst in a parched world. But water alone was not enough. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, God sent ravens, unclean birds by Jewish law, to bring Elijah food. Morning and evening, these birds brought him bread and meat, sustaining him in the wilderness. It was an unusual provision, but it was God's provision. Elijah accepted it with humility and gratitude, understanding that in God's economy, the unlikely and the miraculous often go hand in hand. This period of Elijah's life is not just a story of survival, it is a profound lesson in faith and dependence on God. The drought was a physical manifestation of the spiritual barrenness that had taken hold of Israel. Yet, in the midst of this desolation, God showed that his care for his faithful servant was unfailing. He provided exactly what Elijah needed, exactly when he needed it. This is a truth that resonates with believers even today. In our own lives, we too face droughts, times when our spirits feel dry, when our resources seem scarce, and when the future looks uncertain. In these moments, it's easy to fall into despair, to question God's presence and his plans. But Elijah's story reminds us that God is always there, even in the driest seasons. He may not provide in the way we expect, but his provision is always sufficient. Just as Elijah was sustained by the brook and the ravens, so too can we trust that God will sustain us. Our task, like Elijah's, is to remain faithful, to trust in God's timing and methods, and to obey his commands even when the path ahead is difficult. For it is in these moments of trial that our faith is tested and strengthened. And just as God was faithful to Elijah, he will be faithful to us, guiding us through our personal droughts and providing for our needs in ways that may surprise us. Elijah's early challenges were many, but his faith never faltered. He knew that the God who called him was also the God who would sustain him. And so, as we reflect on this part of Elijah's journey, let us take heart in the knowledge that the same God watches over us. In every trial, in every challenge, His provision is there, waiting for us to trust and obey. Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. Elijah's journey led him to a small town called Zarephath. The drought had spread its fingers far and wide, touching every corner of the land. As he approached the town's gates, Elijah saw a woman gathering sticks. She was a widow, worn by the harshness of life, her face etched with the lines of worry and hunger. There was a heaviness in her step, the kind that comes when hope is nearly gone. Elijah called out to her, asking for a drink of water. As she turned to fetch it, he added another request, "Please bring me a piece of bread." The request seemed simple, but it struck at the core of her despair. She turned back to him, her voice tinged with the resignation of someone who had accepted defeat. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it, and die." In those words, Elijah saw the depth of her desperation. She was at the end of her resources, preparing what she believed would be the last meal she would ever share with her son. Death was the next step, and she had resigned herself to it. But Elijah, filled with the certainty that comes from knowing God's plan, spoke to her with calm assurance. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." It was a bold promise, one that required faith from a woman who had nothing left to give. But something in Elijah's words stirred a glimmer of hope within her. She did as he asked, using the last of her flour and oil to bake a small loaf of bread for the prophet. And when she went back to her jars, she found that the flour and oil had not diminished. Day after day, the supply remained, just as Elijah had said. The jars, once nearly empty, became symbols of God's unending provision. This miracle was not just about physical sustenance, it was about faith. The widow's willingness to trust in Elijah's word, even when it seemed impossible, opened the door for God to work in her life. Her obedience in the face of despair led to a miracle that sustained her and her son through the darkest days of the drought. God's faithfulness shone through the simplest of acts, a woman making bread, a prophet eating, and jars that never ran dry. But the story doesn't end there. Not long after, tragedy struck the widow's household. Her son fell ill, and despite her best efforts, he died. In her grief, the widow turned to Elijah, her words raw with pain and confusion. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah, moved by her sorrow, took the boy from her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying. He laid the boy on his bed and cried out to the Lord. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die?" Then, stretching himself out on the boy 3 times, he prayed, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of Elijah's voice and the weight of his prayer. And then, as if in response to the prophet's plea, the boy's chest rose with breath. Life returned to him, and Elijah carried him downstairs, placing him back into his mother's arms. "Look, your son is alive," he said, simply. In that moment, the widow's grief turned to awe. She looked at Elijah, and her faith, once shaken, was now firmly rooted in the reality of God's power. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she said, "and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." The story of the widow of Zarephath is one of the most poignant in Elijah's life. It is a testament to God's provision in times of need, but more than that, it is a reminder of the power of faith. The widow trusted, even when it seemed there was no reason to, and in return, she witnessed miracles that defied the natural order. The flour and oil that never ran out were symbols of God's daily provision, but the resurrection of her son was a powerful testament to the life-giving power of God, a power that reaches beyond the grave. For modern believers, this story offers a profound lesson. In times of scarcity and loss, when the world seems to offer nothing but despair, faith in God's provision and power can sustain us. Just as the widow's jars did not run dry, neither will God's grace in our lives. And just as her son was brought back to life, so too can our spirits be revived when we place our trust in the Lord. Elijah's encounter with the widow of Zarephath stands as a beacon of hope, a reminder that God is always at work, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Showdown on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel stood silent under the midday sun, its slopes dry and rocky, overlooking the vast expanse of Israel. On this day, it would bear witness to a showdown, not of armies, but of gods. The stakes were high, higher than any battle fought with swords. This was a clash of faith, and the entire nation held its breath. Elijah, the lone prophet of the Lord, stood firm. Before him were 450 prophets of Baal, and beyond them, the people of Israel, who had wandered far from their God. The air was tense with anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm. Elijah's challenge had been simple yet bold, too bold for any ordinary man, but Elijah was no ordinary man. He had called for a contest to prove once and for all who was truly God, Baal or the Lord. The rules were clear. 2 bulls would be prepared as sacrifices, one for Baal and one for the Lord. The prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on his. The God who answered by fire would be recognized as the true God. It was a challenge that would expose the emptiness of Baal and the power of the Lord in a way that could not be denied. The prophets of Baal went first. They took their bull and prepared it, laying it on the altar they had built. Then they began to call on Baal. Morning turned to noon, and their cries grew louder. They danced around the altar, shouting, "Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, no answer, just the sun beating down on their backs and the dust kicking up from their frantic movements. As noon passed, Elijah couldn't hold back any longer. His voice cut through their chants with a sharpness that silenced the crowd. "Shout louder!" he mocked. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." His words were laced with sarcasm, yet they were deadly serious. He knew there would be no answer from Baal because Baal was nothing, a figment of human imagination. The prophets of Baal grew more desperate. They slashed themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed, a grotesque display of devotion. They continued their frenzied calls into the afternoon, but the sky remained silent, empty. There was no fire, no voice, no God to respond to their cries. When evening approached, it was Elijah's turn. The frenzy of the false prophets had exhausted itself, and the people, who had watched with growing unease, now turned their attention to the lone figure standing by a broken altar of the Lord. Elijah called the people to him, and they gathered around as he repaired the altar that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, and rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around it, deep enough to hold water, and then arranged the wood on top. He cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood. But Elijah wasn't finished. He was going to make sure there could be no doubt, no question about what was about to happen. He told the people to fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and the wood. They did as he asked, and the water soaked the wood and the altar. "Do it again," Elijah commanded, and they did. "Do it a 3rd time," he said, and they obeyed. The water ran down the altar and filled the trench. The wood was drenched, the stones were wet, and the trench was full. Then Elijah stepped forward and prayed. There was no shouting, no frenzy, just a simple, powerful prayer. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." In that moment, the heavens responded. Fire fell from the sky, a fierce, consuming blaze that devoured the offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. It was as if the fire had a life of its own, sent directly from the throne of God, leaving nothing behind but scorched earth. The people fell to their faces, their voices trembling with awe and fear as they cried out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The victory was undeniable. Baal was exposed as a fraud, a god with no power, no voice, no existence. The Lord had answered by fire, proving His supremacy over all. But this was more than just a display of power, it was a testament to Elijah's faith. He had stood alone against overwhelming odds, confident not in himself but in the God he served. Elijah's faith was not blind or reckless, it was rooted in a deep, personal relationship with the Lord. He knew the God who had called him, the God who had provided for him, the God who had sustained him through drought and danger. And because of this faith, Elijah was willing to stand alone, to challenge the forces of darkness, and to trust in God's power to prevail. The significance of Mount Carmel cannot be overstated. It was a turning point for Israel, a moment when the people were forced to choose whom they would serve. Elijah's courage and faith in the face of overwhelming opposition serve as a powerful reminder that true faith often requires standing alone, trusting that God's power is greater than any force that stands against us. For believers today, the lesson of Mount Carmel is clear. We are called to stand firm in our faith, even when the world is against us. We may not always see fire fall from heaven, but we can trust that the God who answered Elijah is the same God who walks with us through every challenge, every trial. His power has not diminished, and neither should our faith. Elijah's despair and flight from Jezebel. Elijah had stood on Mount Carmel, and called down fire from heaven. He had seen the false prophets of Baal fall, and the people of Israel turn their hearts back to the Lord. It was a moment of victory, of vindication, the kind that should have bolstered any man's spirit. But for Elijah, the triumph was short-lived. Word of his victory reached Jezebel, the queen who had led Israel into Baal worship. Jezebel was not a woman to be trifled with. Her heart was set on Baal, and her fury was as relentless as the desert sun. When she heard what Elijah had done, she sent a message that dripped with venom, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah, the prophet who had faced down hundreds, felt fear clutch at his heart. The fire on Mount Carmel had been a testament to God's power, but now, faced with Jezebel's threat, the flame within Elijah flickered. He had seen God move in mighty ways, but in this moment, the fear was greater than the memory of fire from heaven. Elijah ran. He fled for his life, leaving behind the people he had just led back to God. He traveled into the wilderness, putting distance between himself and Jezebel, but also between himself and the victory he had just won. His steps were heavy with despair, each one taking him deeper into isolation, into the dark shadow of fear. Finally, he stopped under a solitary juniper tree, its sparse branches offering little shelter from the harshness of the wilderness. Exhausted and broken, Elijah sat down and prayed. But this was not a prayer of faith, nor a prayer of thanksgiving. It was a cry from the depths of despair. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors." This was Elijah, the prophet of God, the man who had stood alone on Mount Carmel, now brought low, his spirit crushed by fear and fatigue. He had seen the power of God with his own eyes, yet here, under the juniper tree, all he could see was his own failure and fear. He was done, spent, with nothing left to give. He wanted to die, to end the struggle, to escape the relentless pressure of his mission. Elijah lay down under the tree and fell asleep, his body and soul both longing for rest. But God was not done with him. Even in his despair, even in his flight, God's care for Elijah did not falter. While Elijah slept, an angel of the Lord came to him. The angel touched him gently, rousing him from his sleep. "Get up and eat," the angel said. Elijah opened his eyes to find bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. It was a simple meal, but it was exactly what he needed. He ate and drank, but the weariness of his soul was not so easily lifted. He lay down again, his heart still heavy, and slept once more. The angel came again, touching him a second time. "Get up and eat," the angel urged, "for the journey is too much for you." There was no rebuke, no reprimand, just the gentle insistence that Elijah needed to take care of himself, to gather his strength for the road ahead. Elijah obeyed, eating and drinking once more. The food strengthened him, renewing his body and spirit. With that strength, Elijah was able to rise and continue his journey. He walked for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There, in a cave, he found shelter. It was not the end of his despair, but it was a turning point, a place where God would meet him not in fire or earthquake, but in a still, small voice that would remind Elijah that he was not alone, that his work was not in vain. Elijah's flight from Jezebel and his breakdown under the juniper tree show us that even the strongest can be brought low. The man who had called down fire from heaven was not immune to fear, not beyond the reach of despair. But it also shows us the tenderness of God, who does not abandon us in our moments of weakness. God's response to Elijah's despair was not one of anger or frustration. He did not chastise Elijah for running or for his lack of faith. Instead, he sent an angel to provide what Elijah needed most: rest, food, and the strength to keep going. In the wilderness, where Elijah felt most alone, God was there, caring for him, renewing him, and preparing him for what was still to come. For us, Elijah's story is a reminder that it's okay to feel overwhelmed, to feel fear, even after great victories. We are human, and there are times when the weight of our journey feels like too much to bear. But just as God cared for Elijah in his darkest moment, he cares for us. He meets us in our need, providing rest and renewal, giving us the strength to rise and continue on the path he has set before us. Elijah's despair did not mark the end of his story, it was a moment in the journey, a valley on the way to the next mountain. And in that valley, he found that God's grace was sufficient, his provision enough, and his presence on the journey to Mount Horeb and encounter with God. Elijah set out on a journey, one that would take him deep into the wilderness, far from the chaos and threats that had driven him into despair. He walked alone, with nothing but the memory of an angel's touch and the strength from the food that had been provided to him. 40 days and 40 nights stretched out before him, a long and solitary path leading to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. The journey was not just a physical trek, but a spiritual one. Each step took Elijah farther from the noise and the clamor of the world he had left behind, and closer to a place where he could confront his own heart, his fears, and his faith. The desert around him was barren, silent, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. But in that silence, there was space to think, to pray, to seek. Elijah walked by day, the sun beating down on him, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. By night, the desert grew cold, the stars distant, the silence absolute. Yet, through it all, he pressed on, driven by something deeper than mere survival. He was seeking an answer, a sign, something that would make sense of the turmoil within him. This was not a journey of triumph, but one of reflection. With every mile, Elijah was stripped down, not just physically, but spiritually. The pride that had perhaps once fueled his prophetic zeal was being worn away, leaving him with the raw truth of his humanity, his fears, his doubts, his exhaustion. But in that stripping away, there was also renewal. The journey was as much about what Elijah left behind as it was about where he was going. Mount Horeb loomed in the distance, its rugged peaks a symbol of God's presence. This was the mountain where Moses had encountered God in the burning bush, where the covenant had been given, where the people of Israel had met their God in fire and smoke. Elijah knew that he was walking towards something sacred, something that could only be found in the silence of the wilderness, far from the distractions of the world. When Elijah finally reached the mountain, he sought refuge in a cave. It was a place of shelter, a place where he could finally rest after the long journey. But more than that, it was a place of encounter, a place where he would meet God, not as the triumphant prophet, but as a man in need of guidance, of comfort, of renewal. As Elijah rested in the cave, a voice came to him, gentle but insistent, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was not a question of geography, but of the heart. Why had Elijah fled? Why had he despaired? What was he truly seeking? Elijah answered with the weight of all he had been carrying. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." It was the cry of a man who had given everything, who had stood alone against the tide of idolatry and sin, and who now felt abandoned, defeated, and utterly alone. Elijah's words were filled with a sense of failure and isolation, as if all his efforts had been in vain. Then, God told Elijah to go out and stand on the mountain, for the Lord was about to pass by. What followed was a series of powerful, earth-shaking events. First, a great and powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks and making the earth tremble. But God was not in the wind. Then, an earthquake shook the ground beneath Elijah's feet, but God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, fierce and consuming, but God was not in the fire. These were the kinds of manifestations one might expect of God, the mighty, the powerful, the awe-inspiring. But God was not in any of them. Elijah, standing at the mouth of the cave, was left with the aftermath of these grand displays, but no divine encounter. And then, after the fire, there came a gentle whisper. A sound so soft, so quiet, that it could have been missed in the cacophony of the preceding events. But Elijah did not miss it. He recognized it for what it was, the voice of God. In that whisper, there was a peace, a stillness that spoke more powerfully than the wind, the earthquake, or the fire ever could. It was in this quiet, in this smallness, that God chose to reveal himself to Elijah. Elijah covered his face with his cloak and stepped out to the mouth of the cave. The same question came again, but this time the answer would be different. The journey to Mount Horeb had been one of stripping away the noise, the fear, the doubt, leaving Elijah open and ready to truly hear the voice of God. The gentle whisper was a reminder that God is not always found in the dramatic, the spectacular, but often in the quiet, the subtle, the intimate moments of our lives. In that whisper, Elijah found the reassurance he needed. God had not abandoned him. He was not alone. There was still work to be done, a mission to fulfill. And with that understanding, Elijah was ready to return, to continue the path set before him, not with the fire and fury of Mount Carmel, but with the quiet strength that comes from knowing that God is with you, even in the silence. Elijah's journey to Mount Horeb and his encounter with God in the gentle whisper is a lesson for all who seek. It is a reminder that in the clamor of life, we must make space for the quiet moments, for the stillness where God's voice can be heard. It is in those moments, not the grand gestures, that we often find the deepest connection with the divine. Elijah's journey was one of renewal, of rediscovering that connection, and it is a journey that each of us must take in our own way, finding God not in the noise, but in the whisper. God's instructions and Elijah's continuation of mission. Elijah stood at the mouth of the cave, the gentle whisper of God still resonating in his soul. The journey had brought him to this moment, and now God had more to say. The wind, the earthquake, and the fire had passed, leaving the mountain still and quiet. It was in this quiet that God spoke, not with thunder, but with clarity and purpose. God gave Elijah new instructions, a renewed mission to carry forward. There were kings to be anointed, and a successor to be chosen. Elijah had fought hard, and though he had felt alone, his work was not finished. God told him to go back the way he had come, to the wilderness of Damascus. There, he would find Hazael and anoint him king over Aram. Then he was to anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. These were not just political moves, they were divine appointments, shifts in the leadership of nations, guided by the hand of God. But the most personal instruction was about Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from Abel Mahola. God told Elijah to anoint Elisha as his successor, the prophet who would continue the work that Elijah had begun. It was a moment of both relief and responsibility. Elijah had carried the burden of prophecy alone for so long, but now he would pass that mantle to another. It was not an end, but a continuation, a handing off of the mission to a new generation. Elijah left the mountain with a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced despair, but God had met him in that dark place and given him the strength to move forward. The journey was not over, but now he had the assurance that the work would continue beyond him, carried on by the one whom God had chosen. When Elijah found Elisha, the younger man was plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen. It was a scene of hard, honest work, far removed from the chaos of kings and prophets. Elijah approached and threw his cloak over Elisha's shoulders, a simple gesture, but one heavy with meaning. This was the mantle of prophecy, the symbol of Elijah's authority and the burden he had carried for so long. Now it would pass to Elisha. Elisha understood immediately. He left the oxen where they stood and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." Elijah's response was as direct as always. "Go back," he said. "What have I done to you?" It was not a rejection, but a recognition of the weight of the decision before Elisha. This was not a path to be taken lightly. It required commitment, sacrifice, and a willingness to walk in the footsteps of a prophet who had stood alone against kings and nations. Elisha returned home, slaughtered the oxen, and used the wood from the plow to cook the meat. He gave it to the people, and they ate. It was a farewell feast, but also an act of finality. There would be no going back to the fields, no return to the life of a farmer. Elisha was leaving everything behind to follow Elijah, to take up the mantle and the mission that God had ordained. Elijah's decision to pass on his mantle to Elisha was more than just choosing a successor, it was an act of profound leadership. He recognized that his time was nearing its end, and that the mission was greater than any one man. Elijah had faced the kings of Israel, the prophets of Baal, and the wilderness of his own despair. Now, in his final acts, he was ensuring that the mission would continue, that the voice of God would not be silenced in Israel. There are lessons in Elijah's journey that reach far beyond the dusty roads of ancient Israel. His courage in the face of overwhelming odds, his unwavering faith in God's plan, and his willingness to pass on the mantle of leadership speak to the qualities that define true spiritual leadership. Elijah was not perfect, he had moments of doubt and despair. But he always returned to his faith, to the calling that had brought him out of obscurity and into the heart of Israel's struggle with idolatry. Leadership, as Elijah demonstrated, is not about power or control. It is about service, about carrying out the mission that God has given, even when the path is difficult, even when the burden seems too heavy to bear. Elijah's story teaches us that true leaders must have the courage to stand alone when necessary, the faith to trust in God's provision, and the humility to know when it is time to pass the mantle to another. Elisha's acceptance of the mantle also carries a lesson. He did not hesitate, but he also did not rush. He took the time to say his goodbyes, to close the chapter of his old life before stepping into the new one. This shows us that the transition of leadership is not just a passing of authority, but a deeply personal and spiritual act, one that requires both parties to be fully committed to the mission ahead. Elijah's journey, from the heights of Mount Carmel to the quiet of Mount Horeb, and finally to the fields where he found Elisha, is a journey of faith and leadership. It is a reminder that God's work is never about one person, but about the continuation of his plan through generations. Elijah's story did not end with him, and that is the mark of true leadership, ensuring that the mission continues, that the voice of God remains strong, long after we are gone. As Elijah walked away from Elisha that day, he knew that the mantle was in good hands. The mission would go on, not because of any one man, but because God had ordained it so. And that, more than any victory over Baal, was Elijah's greatest legacy. Conclusion of Elijah's earthly ministry. Elijah's time on earth was drawing to a close. He had walked the paths of Israel, confronted kings, called down fire from heaven, and passed on his mantle to the next generation. Now, his journey was nearing its final moment. But Elijah's departure would be as extraordinary as his life had been, marked by the unmistakable hand of God. The day began like any other, but there was a sense of purpose, of finality, that hung in the air. Elijah knew that the end was near, and so did Elisha, who had become his constant companion since taking up the mantle. They walked together, traveling from Gilgal to Bethel, and then on to Jericho. At each stop, the company of prophets would come out to meet them, and each time, they asked Elisha if he knew that the Lord was going to take Elijah from him that day. And each time, Elisha replied, "Yes, I know, but do not speak of it." There was a weight in those words, a heaviness that comes when the inevitable cannot be denied. But Elisha stayed by Elijah's side, determined to see his master to the end, to witness the moment when the prophet would be taken up by God. As they reached the Jordan River, Elijah took his cloak, the same one he had cast over Elisha, and rolled it up. He struck the water with it, and the river parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. It was a scene that echoed the miracles of old, a reminder of the power that had always accompanied Elijah's faith. They crossed over, leaving the other prophets behind, and continued walking. Elijah turned to Elisha and asked, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha didn't hesitate. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he replied. It was a bold request, but one that spoke to Elisha's desire to carry on the work of God with the same power and fervor that Elijah had. Elijah, recognizing the gravity of the request, responded, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise, it will not." They continued walking, talking as they went, when suddenly, the sky above them began to change. A chariot of fire, drawn by horses of fire, appeared, descending from the heavens. The whirlwind followed, a mighty force that swept down with the chariot, separating Elijah from Elisha. Before Elisha could grasp what was happening, Elijah was caught up in the whirlwind, lifted from the earth, ascending toward the heavens. Elisha stood rooted to the spot, watching in awe and sorrow as his master was taken up. My father! My father! The chariots and horsemen of Israel, he cried, but Elijah was gone, carried away by the wind and the fire, his earthly mission complete. Elijah's ascension was more than just the end of a prophet's life, it was a divine affirmation of his unique relationship with God. Elijah had lived a life marked by unwavering faith, fierce courage, and a willingness to stand alone when it mattered most. His departure from the earth in a whirlwind was a fitting conclusion to a life lived in the service of a power greater than himself. It was as if God, who had been with Elijah in the quiet whisper on Mount Horeb and the fire on Mount Carmel, had reached down and taken him up, bringing him into his presence without the sting of death. Elisha watched until he could see Elijah no more, and then he picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah as he was taken up. It was more than just a piece of clothing, it was a symbol of the mantle he had inherited, the continuation of the prophetic mission. Elisha returned to the Jordan, struck the water with the cloak, and the river parted once more. The spirit of Elijah rested on Elisha, and the work of God continued, as it always does. Elijah's life is a testament to the power of faith, the importance of courage, and the necessity of standing firm in one's convictions, even when the world seems to be against you. Elijah was a man who faced down kings, confronted the false prophets, and called a nation back to its God. But he was also a man who knew despair, who fled when the pressure became too much, and who needed God's gentle whisper to renew his spirit. In his strengths and his weaknesses, Elijah showed us what it means to be human, and what it means to be a servant of God. Leadership, as Elijah demonstrated, is not about being perfect or infallible. It is about being faithful, about trusting in God's provision and guidance, even in the darkest moments. True leadership requires the courage to stand alone when necessary, the faith to believe in the impossible, and the humility to know that the work is never truly ours, but God's. Elijah's ascension reminds us that our time on earth is limited, but the mission of God is eternal. Each of us, like Elijah, is called to carry out the work we've been given, to pass on the mantle to those who come after us, and to trust that, in the end, it is God who directs the whirlwind. Elijah's life may have ended in a blaze of fire and wind, but his legacy continues in every act of faith, in every moment of courage, in every person who takes up the mantle and says, "Here I am, send me." As we reflect on Elijah's extraordinary life and ascension, we are reminded that the true measure of a leader is not found in their power or their victories, but in their faithfulness to the call of God. Elijah's journey from the dusty roads of Israel to the chariot of fire is a story of faith that challenges us all to live with the same courage, the same conviction, and the same trust in the God who calls us, leads us, and ultimately, carries us home. Application to modern believers. Elijah's story is not just a tale from ancient times. It's a blueprint for living a life of faith in a world that often seems determined to test and break that faith. The challenges he faced, the courage he showed, and the faith he held onto are as relevant today as they were in the days of kings and prophets. His life offers lessons that every believer can apply, no matter the time or place. Elijah teaches us about reliance on God. He walked through the droughts of life, both literal and spiritual, and found sustenance not in the strength of his own hands, but in the provision of God. When the creek ran dry, and the ravens no longer came, Elijah trusted that God would provide another way. And he did, through a widow's meager supply of flour and oil, and later, through the strength to journey to Mount Horeb. In moments when we feel that our resources are depleted, that we have nothing left to give, Elijah's story reminds us that God's provision never runs dry. It might come from unexpected places, but it will come. Elijah also shows us what it means to lead with conviction. He stood alone on Mount Carmel, outnumbered by the prophets of Baal, surrounded by a nation that had turned away from God. But he did not waver. He called on the Lord with the confidence that comes from deep faith, and God answered with fire. Today, we may not face prophets of Baal, but we do face pressures to conform, to compromise our beliefs, to stay silent when we should speak out. Elijah's courage calls us to stand firm in our convictions, to trust that when we act in faith, God will respond. But Elijah's life was not without struggle. He knew despair. After his victory on Mount Carmel, when Jezebel threatened his life, he fled into the wilderness, exhausted and ready to give up. There, under the juniper tree, he prayed for death, feeling utterly alone. Yet, even in his darkest moment, God was there. He didn't rebuke Elijah for his weakness. Instead, he provided what Elijah needed most: rest, nourishment, and the assurance that he was not alone. This is a powerful reminder that it's okay to feel overwhelmed, to have moments of doubt and fear. What matters is that we don't stay there. Like Elijah, we must rise, strengthened by God's presence, and continue the journey. Elijah's story also underscores the importance of mentorship and legacy. When the time came for him to pass on his mantle, he didn't hold back. He chose Elisha, not just as a successor, but as someone to carry forward the mission of God. Elijah understood that leadership is not about holding power, but about passing it on, ensuring that the work continues even after we are gone. In our own lives, we are called to invest in others, to mentor, to lead, and to prepare the next generation to carry on the mission. At Decode Vale, we believe that these lessons from Elijah's life are not just ancient history, they are living truths that can guide us today. Our content is dedicated to exploring these profound spiritual lessons, offering insights that challenge and inspire you to deepen your faith. We don't shy away from the tough questions or the hard truths because we know that growth often comes from wrestling with these very things. We're here to walk alongside you on your spiritual journey, helping you to draw strength from the stories of those who have gone before us, like Elijah, and to apply those lessons in your own life. Elijah's life is a testament to the power of faith, the importance of courage, and the necessity of relying on God in all circumstances. Whether you're facing a drought in your own life, standing alone in your convictions, or feeling overwhelmed by the challenges before you, take heart in knowing that God is with you, just as he was with Elijah. And remember, the journey of faith is not one we take alone. Like Elijah and Elisha, we are part of a larger story, one that continues to unfold with each act of faith, each step of courage, and each moment of reliance on the God who never fails. So as you go forward, let the lessons from Elijah's life be a source of strength and guidance. Stand firm in your faith, trust in God's provision, and lead with conviction. And as always, Decode Vale is here to support you on this journey, providing content that challenges you to grow, to question, and to deepen your understanding of what it means to walk in faith. Elijah's life was a journey of faith, courage, and unwavering reliance on God. From the droughts of the wilderness to the fire on Mount Carmel, he stood firm in his convictions, even when it meant standing alone. He faced despair, but found renewal in God's gentle whisper. And in the end, he passed on his mantle, ensuring that the mission would continue. Now, As we close, I invite you to reflect on your own spiritual and leadership roles. How can you draw strength from Elijah's example? How can you lead with conviction in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments, engage with our channel, and share this message with others who might need it. This is Decode Vale, where ancient truths illuminate the path of the modern believer. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and let the light guide your way.